it, you'll have an opportunity to do that. Please remember that your exam is due Monday, 11:59 p.m. Central Time. You should have enough space in your short answer questions to be able to write as much as you want. Yay. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have during the review session. If you can't make it and you still have questions for me, feel free to email me anytime that you want. I may not answer right away, but I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have. So we're going to go ahead and continue our discussion of memory. All right, there we go. So the last time we were here, we were talking about the important, oh, D, my Wi-Fi is being slow. I'll watch the YouTube feed later. That is okay. I don't know if you can hear me right now, but D, that is totally fine. So the last time that we were here, we were talking about the importance of retrieval cues. So retrieval cues are things that are associated with a particular memory that you can actually use to help you remember what you need. And this can even be something as the context under which you actually studied something. So we tend to find that the best retrieval cues that we make are the ones that we form in encoding, including the room that we're studying in. So you've probably heard pretty common study tips, such as study in the room that you're going to take your test in later because the context matches. And when the context matches, you will end up having better memory performance than if you change that context. Now, this also applies to a few different things. So we have something that is called mood congruent memory. Now, I want to be really clear. I am saying mood congruent, not mood dependent. So mood congruent basically means that when you are in a good mood, you are more likely to remember good memories, and you're also more likely to look at neutral events in a more positive light. This is kind of occasionally referred to as a consistency bias. So if you're having a really good time at Kadi right now, you might look back at high school and think, if you're in a really good place right now, you'll look back on your past and go, yeah, everything was great. You basically modify your understanding of the past to match how you feel right now. If you're feeling really badly about something, if you're not doing well at Kadi, you might look back at previous choices you made and view them in a negative light to make sure that how you feel then and now matches. Can I see your health assessment when you're done? Okay, thank you. So one of the ways that this has a tendency to kind of make things worse, this is a very useful thing. When you're in a good mood, you tend to think of more positive things. When you're in a bad mood, you tend to think of more negative things. Where we can kind of see this leading us astray is something referred to as the cycle of depression. So depression is often defined as something that happens due to a chemical imbalance. Thanks. And it's absolutely true that there are some biological components to depression, but there is also a psychological as well as a social component. And what we know is that if you are struggling with depression, that obviously will have a negative effect on your mood and your behavior. When you feel bad, your mood congruent memory is going to bring up more bad memories or more painful memories, and even neutral events that you are experiencing will be viewed in a more negative light than they normally would. And generally, I don't know about you, when I wake up, because every now and then I wake up and I kind of, for whatever reason, I'm just like, I feel bad. So I'm going to think about things that make me feel bad. And sometimes I've done this where I feel bad. And so I start drawing up all of these negative memories and these negative events, or looking up negative things on the internet. Does anybody get out of that situation actually feeling better? Probably not. If anything, it ends up making you feel worse. So the cycle of depression basically is partially due to this mood congruent memory. When we feel bad, we're going to be more likely to think negative thoughts and draw up negative memories. But there's obviously more to it than just this. So please don't take this as Dr. Gilchrist saying, if you want to not be depressed, just think happy thoughts. I know it's not that simple. I have family members with depression, and the idea of just think positive is basically a slap in the face for anybody who's actually struggling with issues related to mental health, especially now. But we have to talk about one other thing. So we've talked about context-dependent memory. We've talked about mood-congruent memory. We have to talk a little bit about state-dependent memory. And as some of you know, I love The Simpsons. So any opportunity to include a picture from The Simpsons in my lecture is always good. State-dependent memory is basically the finding that, and when I'm talking about state, I am talking about being under the influence of drugs, or as they call them, narcotics. So what we tend to learn in one state is more easily recalled when we are in that state again. So a very common example, and I'll be totally straight with you, I don't drink that much. My favorite drug is caffeine. I've got my Dr. G Fuel. I am good to go. But this occasionally happens to people after a night of drinking. So they get home, they're still coming down from the alcohol. So they might still be a little buzzed or a little bit drunk, and hopefully they had a designated driver. And they put their keys down or they put something down. And then when they wake up in the morning and they've sobered up, they can't remember where they put the thing. And that's partially because when you are in a state such as might be produced by alcohol or something like marijuana, you generally tend to have better recall when you study under the influence and you are tested under the influence. Now, let's be very clear. This is not Dr. Gilchrist telling you that if you happen to be drinking one night while studying, you should show up to my test drunk. Please don't. This is a dry campus. Additionally, you know what will help you? You know when your memory performance is the best? When you study sober and you're tested sober, of course. So this is just a very interesting finding. We find this with alcohol. We also find this with marijuana as well. You tend to do better on a test if the state that you are in matches the state that you were in when you were studying. So now we're going to move on to probably one of my most favorite aspects of talking about memory. So I think oftentimes people tend to believe that memories are these static, perfect images, that they're just like looking into a photo album, or they're just like watching a video camera. And that is really not true. So those of you that are on Zoom and those of you that are in class right now, what I'd like you to do is think back on a memory that you've had pretty recently. Now, here is my question. When you think back on this memory and you see yourself in that memory, are you looking from the first person perspective, like you're looking through your own eyes? Or are you watching yourself from a third person perspective? So you are watching yourself as if you were watching yourself in a play. So you're watching yourself act things out, but it's not through your own eyes. So who has a first person perspective and who has a third person perspective? Okay, Mariah, you have a third person perspective? Third person? A little bit of both? That's fine too. So here's what's kind of interesting. When you are acting out events in everyday life, do you have a third person perspective? No, you do not, unless you are looking at yourself in a mirror while you talk, or you are recording yourself at every opportunity. You do not have a third person perspective of yourself. You only have a first person perspective. So this is my point. If you have a third person perspective in a memory, That is absolute evidence that you have reconstructed it, that you've rebuilt it, that you have changed it. So memories are not like static images or photographs. They can actually be transformed and distorted by new information. So here's an example. So yesterday when I was driving down Austin, there was a little bit of a car accident right in front of Pete's, and I had to kind of find some back routes to go around. Now, I bring up images of car accidents because you can see instances where new knowledge or new information can change how you view an event. So let's say that you are in a car accident, and thankfully you're okay, but the driver who was at fault, you didn't know it at the time, but you find out later that he was driving under the influence. And maybe now that you have that new information, you change your memory to basically make it seem like he was driving more erratically and less well than he actually was as a result. Now, some other ways that this tends to happen, there's a really famous study by Elizabeth Loftus and Palmer from the 1970s that actually had participants viewing images of a car accident. And this was in the 1970s. These were not like the best made cars on earth. They didn't really have the safety regulations they have today. So we're talking like a very simple fender bender. What's interesting is that some of the participants were asked how fast, so they watched this video, and then some people were asked, how fast did you see the car run into the yield sign? And it wasn't actually a yield sign that was shown in the video. They actually got a stop sign. But what's kind of interesting is that if you tell somebody, hey, how fast were the cars going and did you see the one hit the yield sign? People tend to falsely remember a yield sign in their reconstruction of events. And leading questions can absolutely do things like that. They can change our memories. One of the other things, especially, how many of you have memories that have been told in your family over and over and over again for entertainment value to the point where you and another person disagree on how the memory happened? How many of you have had that happen? So one of the things that we know is that there's a difference between memory for accuracy and memory for entertainment. The more that you are striving to entertain people with sharing a memory, the more you're likely to embellish, exaggerate, add different details. And here's what's interesting. Every time that you recall a memory, and especially if you are telling it for entertainment value, you are running the risk of further distorting it and believing that these embellishments are actually true. And it turns out that telling memories for entertainment purposes actually decreases their accuracy over time. So you might be saying to yourself, well, Dr. Gilchrist, last class you talked about flashbulb memories, these really, really vivid memories where you told us you remembered where you were on September 11th, and that was very vivid. That must be right. Well, yeah, a good chunk of it is. But one of the things that I mentioned is that with these flashbulb memories, they're not necessarily any more accurate. They're actually just as prone to distortion and error as other types of memories. The difference is we tend to be more confident in these memories. So I'm showing you here. So this is footage of the South Tower, the first tower that was actually to be hit. And you can actually see the footage of the plane going to hit the second tower. So here's what's really interesting. There is no video footage of the plane that hit the first tower, at least not that day. The footage of the second tower being hit by a plane was caught on videotape because at that point, they were already doing news stories on it. So they happened to capture it on video. When I woke up that morning and went to a 9:30 class, a plane had hit the first tower and they were already reporting on it, and a plane had not yet hit the second tower. And at the time, I thought it was an accident. I didn't realize what it was. And me, in my ever-present 18-year-old wisdom, who thought she was so much better than everybody else, saw the footage, saw it as an accident, rolled my eyes and went, idiots, and then walked off to class. Hindsight 2020, probably not the best response. But it wasn't until much, much later in the day, after I had been in my psychology of women and gender class, that I learned that this was a part of a coordinated attack. But at the time, people didn't know that. What's interesting, though, is that if you asked people, did they see video footage of a plane hitting the first tower? They'll tell you they saw it. That footage doesn't actually exist. And the only way you would have seen that is if you lived in New York or you were right near this area at the time. But because we now know that both towers being hit was part of a coordinated attack during that day, people tend to believe that they've seen footage of this being hit when no such footage actually exists. So again, our flashbulb memories are very, very vivid memories for very highly emotional events. These can be events that have happened in your own life. These can also be events that happen nationally or internationally. Ask your parents or your grandparents sometime if they remember the Challenger disaster back in the 80s, or if they remember where they were when they learned that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Odds are pretty good they can tell you where they were. So really quick, when I gave the class an experiment, and by the way, I collected your data, those of you that handed it in, I will be adding extra credits soon. It turns out that we actually replicated the original effect. Many of you reported false memories at about the same rate that the original experiment did. So congratulations. We're not special. We're just like the original study. Yay. One of the reasons that this worked as well as it did was because all of the items were related to each other. Remember that information in memory is bound by that web of connections. So if you activate one, you can activate the others, and that will lead you to believe that you saw a word when you didn't actually see it. That is especially true for one lucky participant who recalled the critical lore. We call it a lore, like we're trying to trick you. We had one lucky person who recalled the critical lore every single time. Okay, so really quick, and when I show this later on the live stream, I am going to have to cut it probably for reasons of copyright. We will see if that happens. But I'm going to show you a video. And I will kind of warn you, it's not super violent, it's cartoonish violence, but just to kind of give you a heads up, you are about to watch a video of a crime. All right, here we go. So you're gonna, oh, wait, I gotta share the computer sound. We gotta wait. Okay. Are you ready? Hopefully you are watching along right now. And here we go. So watch the video of the crime.
Rise in the number of hijackings in central Gauteng, with one hijack taking place every 30 seconds.
Hijack. Hi. Hijack. Hi. Hijack. Hi. Hijack. Hi.
Okay, so hopefully you watched that video of a crime. Okay, I will ask you a few questions toward the end of this lecture and see if you are able to remember the details of the event. So we are going to move on. So for those of you that I talk about amnesia and forgetting in a separate video. I would encourage you to watch that to help you prepare for the test. But right now we are going to talk a little bit about how memory works in our everyday lives. So as I kind of mentioned, recall and the things that we tend to remember are typically not going to be an exact replica of original events. They tend to be constructed from various sources. And oftentimes we are going to fit memories in with our existing beliefs. So for an example, let's say that there is a person that you don't like, and they say something to you, or they have a very neutral interaction with you, but you don't like them. And you are generally not predisposed to think favorably upon them. And so what we're often going to find is that in those cases, our memories of those events, because we do not like this person, are actually going to be more negative than they really are. So if you have a certain belief about a person or a group of people or a situation, you are going to be more likely to interpret that particular memory based on the things that you already believe. So one of the ways that this kind of comes into play is when we talk about schemas. So a schema is a mental representation of an object, a scene, or an event. We last talked about schemas when we were dealing with Piaget's different theories of child development. And one of the things that we kind of talked about with schemas that children have, they have schemas for things like a dog, or they have things like what a cow is, and this animal is a cow, and this animal is not a cow. And odds are pretty good that you also operate with a variety of different schemas in your life. So for example, you might have a schema for people at your high school that you went to. So for example, the schema that I kind of remember from my high school, and please bear in mind that this was the early 2000s, my school was full of a bunch of wealthy preppy types that played lacrosse. That's a schema. Now, obviously, most people are not actually going to fit that schema, but it's a very quick way to provide a framework for new information. So if I see somebody who goes to that high school or went to that high school, I am likely to assume that they also were a wealthy preppy. So yes, this is where I kind of mentioned that as we are collecting information about the world, we develop these schemas to help us navigate it quickly. Now, let's be very, very clear. This is a very, very lazy way of doing things. We don't necessarily take the time to explore each situation or each person as an individual situation. Rather, what we end up doing is we kind of fit them into this basically stereotype of what we already know or what we already believe to make our lives easier. And sometimes this is fine. Other times it can really lead us astray. So really quick, I'm going to show you a picture. This is a famous picture by researchers Brewer and Treyans. And they basically presented a bunch of students. They basically showed a bunch of students this image. So this is an image of a teaching assistant's office back in 1981. And so here's what's kind of interesting. You have an idea, you have a schema of what a professor's office should contain, right? You have a pretty good schema. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. So they showed participants this image. And then later on, they had the participants basically try to remember what they saw. So here's what's kind of interesting. The participants all said that they saw books, or a sizable proportion of participants said that they saw books. There are no books in this image at all. So there are a variety of different things here. There's a typewriter because, well, 80s. Not everybody could afford an expensive computer. There's a bottle of wine. This is clearly before dry campuses, a picnic basket, a skull, a globe. So I'm assuming this might be an anthropology or a geography person. So there's a lot of different things here. There's coffee because grad student, of course, but there's no books. So this is a case where you have a schema of what should be contained in a professor or a grad student's office. And I actually see this in action all the time. I can't tell you how many students have come into my office and said, "You don't have a lot of books in here, Dr. Gilchrist." And you're right, I don't. My field tends to operate more on journal articles, so do not look in my file cabinets, they're a mess. But when you say to me, "You don't have a lot of books in here," it's very, very clear that you have a schema that my office should have books. And so sometimes this can lead us to falsely recalling things that we otherwise did not see because it fits in our schema. The same is true when we're talking about crimes and events. You have a schema for what a criminal looks like. So you will see very interesting things where people may misremember that a female criminal was that there was a female criminal, but people misremember the criminal as being male because we have this idea that men are more likely to be criminals than women are, and that's not always the case. So schemas, they help us navigate our world quickly based on our previous experiences, but they're not perfect and they're not always ideal. And like I mentioned, they do lead to stereotyping, which we will talk about later in social psychology. Now, a script is a very, very different type of schema. So a script is basically a schema that's based on a mental organization of events in time. And this can actually help us understand people's behavior. So when you're interested in somebody and you want to go on a date, what kind of steps happen to get to a first, what sequence of steps happens in a first date, typically? So go ahead and hop on Zoom or in the chat. What sequence of steps happens for a first date? And yes, I kind of realize like young people don't really date anymore, they hang out. But let's say you're hanging out with somebody for the first time, if that helps. You pick them up, okay? What happens next? You go to a place. What place is that usually? Either a restaurant or usually maybe something like coffee. Anybody else? We get food. Hopefully you talk for a while. And then maybe you do something else. Maybe you don't. And then they drop you off. And if you're lucky, you get a kiss. And I'll call you later.
And they don't.
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do call back. Or you go, "I had a really good time, but I don't feel a spark," or something like that. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. You'll notice that there's some flexibility here. So notice that you go to a place. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a restaurant or a coffee shop. It could be a movie. It could be an art gallery. It could be a lot of different things. I once went on a date with somebody where we basically shopped for plants at IKEA. It sounds awesome until you understand that I kill plants. I am not a green thumb. I am like a bringer of death for plants. I'm pretty good with animals and other human beings, though, thankfully. So scripts are really useful, and here's why. So let's say that we're checking out a brand new restaurant that's opened up somewhere. So it's not like I go into the restaurant and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't understand how anything works here. This is a brand new restaurant. I don't get it. We don't do that. And the reason that we don't do that is because we already have a pretty good sense of what kind of things go on in a restaurant. Now, here's what's really important. Restaurants are different, and sometimes you have different experiences. So the script really needs to be flexible. Sometimes you pay before you eat. Sometimes you pay after you eat. Sometimes you are picking up food and taking it out, which is pretty much all I do anymore. Sometimes you eat in. Sometimes you take your food and you eat it outside on a patio. Sometimes there are places to sit. Sometimes there are not. Sometimes you have to wait to be seated. Sometimes you don't. So the scripts are flexible. They have to be because you are going to encounter a variety of different experiences. And it's also why you don't freak out every time you go to a new restaurant you've never been to before. You know the score. You have a script that can help you. So really quick, go ahead and help me answer these questions about the criminal activity that we saw in that video. Okay, so first of all, can somebody on the chat tell me what weapon the criminal used? What weapon did the criminal use? Okay, shotgun, yes, he had a sawed-off shotgun. Okay, what color were the criminal's shoes? They were white, they were dirty white sneakers. Okay, final question. What color were the criminal's eyes? Okay, somebody said brown. Now, he had glasses on. Okay, now sometimes when I ask people this, they're like, oh yeah, they were brown. And I mean, yeah, hazarding a guess, they probably are. Most people have brown eyes. That's a pretty good guess. But you very rightly noted that he had sunglasses on, so we can't actually tell. So sometimes those kind of questions can actually throw people off. So here's something that's kind of related to this. So the questions that you ask, so if I ask what color are the criminal's eyes, there's that implication that I know what they are and you should have seen that. It's kind of the same logic behind, so you know how Alex Trebek asks all the trivia questions on Jeopardy? People think that because he's asking the questions that he actually knows all of these things. So we have a tendency when somebody's asking us trivia questions to believe that the asker is much smarter than they actually are, because they're the ones asking you the questions, they have the answers, and you're assuming they have the answers because they must know the answers. So I actually find that kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about how this applies to eyewitness testimony. So the defense calls Officer Hackett to the stand. You were first to arrive at the scene of the crime. Describe to the court what you saw. Fireflies danced on the lake as the sun sank behind the deep purple hills that ring the Prussian blue water like protective arms. A cool breeze rustled the leaves and sent shivers of ripples playing across the calm, silent lake. The crime, get to the crime. So we're going to talk about eyewitness testimony. And for many of you, this is probably going to be the most interesting section of memory. And it's where we actually get to some pretty controversial stuff. So don't write this down, but eyewitness testimony, we treat it as an absolute certainty. We treat it as an infallibility. And Elizabeth Loftus, who has done a lot of research related to the power of leading questions and eyewitness testimony and memory construction, actually pointed out this certainty by saying there is nothing more convincing than a live human being who takes the stand, points a finger at the defendant and says, that's the one. That looks really cool. But here's the thing, eyewitness testimony is based on memory. And as we have already learned, Memory is not static, and it's not a picture perfect image. It's fallible, it's prone to mistakes, it's prone to errors, and it's especially prone to leading questions. So unfortunately, I can't show you the video of the crime, so I already kind of showed you another crime with fake questioning. So you have a schema for what a criminal is. So go ahead in your mind and think about a criminal. Do you have a certain image of this person? Based on stuff I've seen on TV, they usually have on like a little black ski cap. They have like a 5 o'clock shadow and a very angry face and a crowbar, and they're usually male. That's my schema of a criminal. Now yours might be a little bit different from mine. But it's all usually based on different things that we have been exposed to. And so, as I kind of mentioned, memory can be distorted as people try to fit new information into schemas that they already have. So when you have a schema for what a robbery looks like or a mugging looks like, and you do have those things because you've seen them on TV, you've seen them in movies, it's even possible that some of you have lived through them. So for example, you can have a criminal whose face is completely covered up with a balaclava. That is not a baklava, but a balaclava is like a ski mask that covers up the face. You can't actually see what gender the criminal is. But most people will misidentify that criminal as being male because a lot of people have a schema that criminals are male, and that's not always true. Now, here's what makes eyewitness testimony even harder. So we're already distorting information into our schemas. The other thing is that eyewitnesses are seeing something once and they have to remember it. So it's not like if you get mugged by somebody, you're not going to go, hey, mugger, can you come back and try to mug me again so I can see your face this time? Nobody's going to do that. You have one chance to try to remember as much information you can. And here's the other thing. In a lot of crimes, it is entirely possible that you're in survival mode. You're trying to focus on staying alive. And when you're focused on staying alive, you're probably not focusing on how you're going to identify this criminal for later. So you have to see something incredibly complex with a lot of detail, and then you have to remember it. And it only happens once. So oftentimes we are going to filter or fill in missing pieces of information to help our stories make more sense. And this is what's known as the misinformation effect. We basically incorporate misleading information into a memory of an event. So this is where those leading questions come into play. If I give you a leading question, I am giving you new information. And that information from that question can change how you perceive that event. So we're going to talk about a really famous study by Loftus and Palmer back in 1974. And so here's the basic idea. So you have to watch a video of a car accident. So this is really similar to the one I told you about earlier, where I said, did you see the car pass the yield sign? And many people falsely recall seeing a yield sign when it was actually a stop sign. So here's the depiction of the actual accident. Here's where the misinformation comes into play. Loftus and Palmer divided people into groups, showed them that accident, and then asked them, depending on the group they were in, questions. Now, here's what's really critical. The question was always the same. Only one word was altered across each group. That's a really good manipulation. So here, group A gets, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Group B gets, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Another group got, how fast were the cars going when they bumped each other? Another group got, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other? So we're getting the exact same question, estimate the speed, but we are changing just a single word from group to group to group. So what happened? The wording actually changed how people estimated how fast the cars were going. The speed estimates depended on the phrasing of the question. So if you got the word smashed, you were far more likely to estimate that the car was going faster than if you got something like contacted. I actually think that's kind of interesting. I would assume that bumped has a slower estimate of speed than contacted, but maybe that's just me. Here's the other thing that's interesting. So they also asked people, did you see broken glass in the original video? You can actually see here, there is no broken glass. That's not broken glass. That's part of the top of the car or the hood. I don't know much about car parts. So what's interesting is here, all of a sudden, depending on what group you were in and what word you got, many people believed that they had falsely seen broken glass when they didn't. So group A, who got hit, only about 14% remembered broken glass. But if you got the word smashed into and smashed in, you tend to think that glass is going to break when you hear smash. And so about 32% of group B believed that they had seen broken glass in the video when no broken glass was actually shown. So wording changed the speed estimate, and it actually changed their memory of what they saw. That is really interesting, and it really goes to show how leading questions and embellishments can change what you remember. Now, here's where it gets even more difficult. By the time that an eyewitness testifies in court, which it takes a while for cases to go to court in the first place, they have retrieved that memory numerous times. And remember what I said, every time that you try to retrieve a memory, you are running the risk for increased errors and increased distortions. That's a problem. I will have some Dr. G fuel because I haven't had any yet. Oh, I showed up on the Cotty College Facebook page. Oh, check me out. You probably can't see that. Check me out. All right, are we good? Cool. So one of the other ways that we can kind of see this in everyday life is source amnesia. We basically attribute an event to the wrong source that we experienced or heard or read or imagined. So sometimes when you're listening to something on the radio, this especially happens. Have you ever had instances of similar songs coming out around the same time? So how many of you are familiar with Katy Perry's Roar? I kind of like that song. How many of you are familiar with Sarah Bareilles' Brave? Now, what's really interesting is they sound a lot alike. So occasionally you've had these instances where a song comes out and then suddenly another musician kind of pops out of the woodwork and is like, you took the backing from my song. And the other person's like, well, no, I actually wrote this. It's an original, but this is a case where you've misplaced the source. Maybe this artist had listened to the other musician's music earlier and they didn't realize that it had come from somebody else and not from their own mind. So for example, there have been instances where people believe that an event has happened to them, but it's actually something that they imagined or something that they dreamed about or something that they told a friend. So let's kind of keep that in mind. And the next time you hear similar songs, you will now know why. So we're going to finish by talking about something that's actually kind of controversial. So your book is going to spend more time talking about repressed and recovered memories. And I will talk about that when I record those readings this afternoon. I wrote 3 exams this week, so I haven't had time to record, but I will this afternoon. But we have to talk about eyewitness testimony in children. And this is where it gets really tricky. You don't necessarily want to rely on the recall of events from a child's point of view. They can be really unreliable, and here's why. Children are really vulnerable to leading questions, and they have a very rich imagination. They have a very magnificent fantasy life. So something that's actually happened with kids before, you can ask them to remember. You can ask them to remember an event that has never actually happened. And I believe this was done by Ceci and colleagues. And they had to basically imagine what it would be like to get their finger caught in a mousetrap, which doesn't really happen to a lot of people. So the children have to come up with this story of them getting their finger caught in a mousetrap. And they're like, I was bleeding and I was crying and my dad took me in the ambulance and my little brother wouldn't stop talking. So they come up with this story. You follow up with them months later and you ask them, was that real or was it not? And they will tell you. So this was a fake event that they were told to make up. They now believe that it happened. And their rationale is, well, if it didn't happen, why do I remember it? And they will actually tell the researchers that. So for children, not all of them at this point are capable of separating imagination from reality. And for many of them, if they imagine something, it's enough to make it real. So I'm going to finish by talking about improving your memory because we only have 1 minute left. And these are kind of based on some things that I have talked about in these lectures. Study repeatedly, space it out, actively think about your material, make it meaningful, use appropriate context, try to minimize interference where you can. Don't study for multiple tests in the same day if you can possibly avoid it. I know that we professors do not always do a good job scheduling at them at different times, but I don't know what all classes you take besides mine. Get some sleep because that also reduces interference, and test yourself, test yourself, test yourself, and you will do great on my test. So I will see you on Sunday night at 8 o'clock for Zoom. And I can't wait to see you there. And I will see you on Monday and we will start talking about thinking, language, and intelligence and why IQ is kind of weird. Have a great weekend, everybody. Make good choices. And you know the drill. Don't lick doorknobs. I'll see you later.